Well, it's great for everybody to come out here. On Sunday, I know that a lot of you have been wrapping up this war for days now, and some of us have been working on it for 6 years, and so it's a little bit hard to imagine that we're coming down the stretch here. I still have a few more things, including that event at that little school in Charlottesville next Saturday, which will reflect on sort of the memory of all of this. You know, I'm really honored to have a chance to come here. As Josie mentioned, I'm chairman of the board of the American Civil War Museum, of which this is an integral part. And hearing from Josie and Wade about the people who've come from all over the world to this place over the last week, and to feel that they're getting a kind of depth of understanding that's hard to get anywhere else, feels great. And so when I was invited to speak, I jumped at the opportunity. And frankly, I don't know whose idea it was, maybe Josie's, to talk about the Valley of the Shadow. I've not talked about it in a little while, but that's excellent because I'm getting ready to live in it in the next few months again. So the basic idea is, move me over here, that it's every piece of information about every person who lived in a northern community and a southern community throughout the era from John Brown's raid all the way through Reconstruction. Because I'm a little frustrated by the way that we do Civil War history, which we break it into pieces. And we sort of defend, I'm a military historian, I'm a social historian, I'm a political historian, I'm a historian of the African American experience, I'm a historian of women's experience, I'm a historian of the South, I'm a historian of the North. I just don't think you can do it that way. And the whole idea was, what if we understood, I don't know about you all, but I live every kind of history every day. You know, so I live in economics, I live in politics, I live in my own family history all the time. And so the idea was, what if we wrapped our understanding around the entire experience of all the people who lived in the South and all the people who lived in the North. They're only 200 miles apart, but that straight line across the bottom of Franklin County, across the bottom of Virginia, Pennsylvania, of course, is the boundary between slavery and freedom. And so this gets us past a lot of the easy explanations for the Civil War, that it was industrial versus agrarian, which it's not. That it was the frozen North against the humid South, which is not. These are the same soil, same climate, same ethnicity, same religion, same churches, same trading partners. This is Washington, D.C. And yet they decided within 6 months that they would go to war and kill each other for 4 years. And Augusta County, like most of Virginia, wasn't really all that enthusiastic about that secession thing. But once they did secede, they gave themselves over totally. And the Stonewall Brigade has its anchor here in Augusta County, and Franklin County filled with Democrats and who were skeptical about Abraham Lincoln, but they vote for the same proportion of Abraham Lincoln as the rest of the North in 1860, and then again in 1864, and they also supply enormous numbers of men. They also have, as we'll hear in a minute, one of the largest free black populations in the North, and they also have they were the only place that was burned to the ground by the rebels. So you got that going on as well. So that's what I've been working on. And the thing is enormous. It took us forever to build it back at UVA. I'm very grateful to UVA for sustaining it now that I've been gone. We started this in 1993 when the web was 6 months old. I already had the idea of sharing the entire historic archive with as broad an audience as possible. So all of you are investing yourselves enough to go to places to see what the landscape is like, what the feel in the air is, you know exactly where these units were. And as you know, there's no substitute for that. My belief is there's also no substitute from seeing where history actually comes from. It doesn't come from books. It comes from all the raw materials of newspapers and letters and diaries and censuses and military records and tax records and church records and all those things. And so my idea was, wouldn't it be great if we let people see history for themselves rather than getting it second or third hand? And so that was the idea behind the Valley of the Shadow, and it really was completely weird in the early 90s. And now, as I'll show you, we're continuing to build on the idea of sharing the historic archive as broadly as possible. And so, but the point that was also was to write a book, and you know, this is the hardback or the paperback that's out there. And so I sat down with this archive, and actually it turned out at Stanford University in California, and nothing but I can't talk and click at the same time, with nothing but a laptop connected to UVA, and wrote this book. And it's a book that has nothing in it that everybody in the world can't see too. And it used about 5% of the archive to write this much. And back in 03, they asked me to become, 01, they asked me to become dean of the College and Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia. And I called up my publisher and I said, I've written 500 pages, and it goes from John Brown's raid to the day before Gettysburg, when it looks for all the world as if the Confederates are going to win this thing, and there's no indication that the end of slavery is going to come out of all this. You can have that now, or you can wait 10 years, and I'll give you 1,000 pages, and we'll go all the way through. And my publisher said, bless his heart, we'll take what you got now, Ed. And so this is bad salesmanship, because I want you to buy that book out there, and I've already signed them, so I guess somebody's bought them already. And but it ends on the day before Gettysburg. It actually says 1863 right on here on the front. But you'll know, as experts in the Civil War, especially after being here, the Civil War does not end then. And so starting in June, when I'm finished with the presidency, I'll be sitting in a room somewhere else and writing the rest of the story. So today's talk is a nice bridge for me to start thinking about what happens after Appomattox. What's happening at around the same time, and how does that story unfold? And so Volume 2 will be called The Thin Light of Freedom, and it'll be exploring how in the world did the end of slavery come out of this war, which did not begin to end slavery, and then what shapes did that freedom take, and what did it mean for the North? What did it mean for white Northerners? Okay, as well as what it means for white Southerners. I don't think that story's really been told. Again, because of Reconstruction historiography, we do the same thing. We kind of chop things up into different kinds of pieces. So that's what I'm getting ready to do. So I will appreciate your all's help today and help me think it through by asking questions that are just hard enough to be stimulating, but not so hard as to embarrass me. So we can do all this. So as you can see, basically the Valley of the Shadow is a giant archive, and it's basically every source that we could think of to use to write this. So I'm going to give you some of the things that are in it today. You know, I don't know if I really need my glasses or not, and I'm always self-conscious wearing them, not because I'm vain, just because I'm not used to wearing them. Yeah, you're still there. I think I can do without them. So here's the thing, too. This is a kind of discipline that I think is necessary, and I'll share a secret with you. You can find quotes to make any argument about the Civil War that you want to make. And the way that we write many books of Civil War history, we go out and find the 200 quotes that we kind of think are true. And I'm not suggesting there's bias or purpose. It's just that it's such a huge array of evidence that you can really make. Soldiers fought for this. No, they fought for this. They were ready to give up. No, they weren't. You know, it's frustrating to me because if you don't have any discipline. So the idea was here, we're only going to say what people could actually know from one day to the next, which is the only way that people live history, and they could only see what they could see. Now, we write history kind of from God's perspective, you know, as if you can see everything at one time. But one thing I point out, nobody saw the Battle of Gettysburg. Okay? You could not see the whole thing, and it took forever afterwards to piece it all together. And I think that history can't speak to us if we give up that sense of how people are acting with what they can know. That's kind of the gospel that I have of history. Let's put ourselves back into that place. Let's don't be morally superior to people who are dead. Anybody can pass judgment on people who can't fight back, right? People will be passing judgment on us someday. How are we living amidst the inequalities and injustice that we're living among, right? So all of my idea is a kind of disciplined humility to see what they could see and therefore perhaps figure out why they did the things they did, which sometimes puzzle us. Okay? So that's really kind of what I'm really all about. So let's pick up the story in January 1865. The war's coming to an end, and look at it through the eyes of a black soldier from Franklin County. As it turns out, we have the largest. So when I was working on this, the New York Times wrote an article about the Valley of the Shadow, and an older historian wrote me, he said, you would never have found it, but the largest single collection of letters from United States colored troops are from your county, but at the National Archives, they're filed in the county next door because the woman who was the widow moved over there, and when she died, she was in that county, but all her husband and all her brothers wrote her dozens, maybe hundreds of letters. And he said, I can't read them. And I said, hey, I know where a lot of 20-year-old eyes are. And we'll copy those and we'll transcribe them. And so we actually have the largest single collection of the United States Colored Troops letters from a single group of people. And they joined the 54th Massachusetts within days of its founding, which is an interesting thing. You saw where Franklin County, Pennsylvania is, right? And so there they are with Denzel Washington and, and going over there. And it's an amazing thing. And they fight all the way through. And they're barely literate. So their letters, we present them in both forms, the way that it looks. Then we transcribe them so you can search them and things. But even though they're barely literate, they are very eloquent. Here, Jacob Christie writes his sister, Mary Jane. We have been fighting as brave as ever there was any soldier's fought. I know if every regiment that are out and have been out would have done as well as we, the war would be over. I do really think that in God's will that this war shall not end till the colored people get their rights. So this is January 1865. He writes colored with a capital C, right? This war's not going to end till the colored people get their rights. For white people who resisted what was happening, what was coming, Christie conceded, quote, it goes very hard for the white people to think of it, but by God's will and power, the colored people will have their rights. He admitted that some of those that are living now may not live to see it. But he says, I shall die trying for our rights so that others that are born hereafter may live and enjoy a happy life. Now here the Christie family are living in poverty. The North is no heaven for black people. And that they are marginalized, and the Democratic newspaper reads about the formation of the United States Colored Troops, and they laugh, and they said they hear that some people are coming here to recruit. And they said there's not going to be any of these guys. And then the next week's newspaper, they're furious because so many of the African-American men of Franklin County have gone off to 54th Massachusetts that it's going to hurt Pennsylvania's enlistment numbers. And so basically they can't win, of course. Whatever they do, they're betraying. And so I think Franklin County had probably the largest percentage of African-American men fight for the Union, I think, of any county in the North. Now, and you saw where it was? I think it's because they have fled from Maryland and Virginia and stayed to be close to family, right? Because otherwise, why wouldn't you be gone to Canada, right? Why would you stay so close? And they pay a price for that. When Lee comes through Franklin County on the way to Gettysburg, one of the first things that happen is that African Americans are rounded up and taken into slavery. And they're running through the cornfields of Pennsylvania hiding and being hidden in basements and stuff by some white friends. And some of them flee all the way to Harrisburg. And so that's the story. And you'll see, looking closely at Northerners and Southerners, scrambles the story of all good or all bad in ways that I think that's useful for you. So you can see that the white North should have realized that having 200,000 black soldiers and sailors might have well won the war for them. But now the war was over, the men were slowly discharged, and Jacob Christie did not want his discharge until the 54th was officially and completely disbanded. He wanted to stay with, quote, with the old regiment as long as she is together. He wanted to be with it to the end to demonstrate for the whole world what it meant and had accomplished. I came away from Massachusetts with it, he declared, and I want to go back with it to march through the city of Massachusetts again. He wanted the people there to see the ripped, frayed, and bullet-riddled flag and to see with their own eyes what the regiment had done. Just to look at it, anybody can tell what we have been doing. We fought hard many a time for them. So he wants to march through the city of Boston and people to see the flag that they've had down there. But when Christie and his fellow black soldiers came back to Franklin, they found things no better for themselves in the North than they had been before the war. Black veterans remained poor and were even stripped of the vote in several states. Without the vehicle of the war and of the Army, Northern blacks found themselves shunted aside as they had been before a desperate United States turned to them to save the Union cause. So when you look at the Northern newspaper, and as you can do, even though we've transcribed it with all those 20-year-old eyes, let's see if this is the one. Nope. So that's what it looks like the day after Gettysburg. This is the Republican newspaper up there. General Grant, son of Austerlitz, Lee finds his Waterloo, surrender. You get all the story. And then this is the poem they published, a part of it at the time. Welcome home. Oh, the men who fought and bled. Oh, the glad and gallant tread and the bright skies overhead. Welcome home. Oh, the brave returning boys. Oh, the overflowing joys and the guns and drum and noise. Welcome home. There the women stand for hours with their white hands full of flowers, raining down the perfume showers on the dear men marching home. Do you see him in the line? Something makes him look divine, and a glory makes him shine coming home. The white hands full of flowers. And so starting then, the understanding is that the war for the North is about white soldiers. So the Union had turned against slavery itself only after the war, and the enslaved people themselves had forced them to do so. At war's end, they imagined that the war had always been about abolishing slavery. This is the final stanza. And we thank you, slavery's dead, and the hosts of wrong are fled, and the rights prevail instead. Welcome home. Limb and tongue and press are free, and the nation shouts to see all the glory yet to be. Welcome home. So even though about half the men in Franklin County have voted against Abraham Lincoln in fall of 1864, now they're all together, and they always were, and the memory starts getting cleaned up. You know how that all works all along the way. And that's another thing about the Valley of the Shadow, is that you don't just have, and then here's the bottom line at the end, you've got all the lines along the way when people are trying to figure out what the heck is going on. So now let's follow the end of the war through the eyes of a white Southerner. And this is Joseph Waddell. He's an intelligent, kind-hearted, and nearsighted former editor who got to live at home in Stanton, much to our benefit. And he was with his wife and sister throughout the war, and he was underemployed, so he spent a lot of his time sort of at the newspaper or at the railroad station or on the streets. And then, bless his heart, he wrote down everything. So we pick up in January of 1865 when Jacob Christie was writing his letters home from the USCT. Alas, there is nothing cheering in the world for us to look forward to. Everybody depressed. I hardly ever look into a newspaper. Can't afford to subscribe for one, and they are filled with everything that is depressing. Their attempts to encourage the people only prove that a feeling of discouragement prevails. Our cause seems nearly hopeless. General Lee not only urges that Negroes shall be employed as soldiers, but that a general system of emancipation be inaugurated. The Yankees, he says, are doing both, and we must make a virtue of necessity. So the ironies of this are everywhere. I don't really need to just think what it meant that Lee would turn to enslaved men to help this new nation that would be based on slavery. The work of 4 million enslaved people had been the only way the Confederacy had been able to imagine itself into being in the first place, and to put virtually every white man able to fight into its army or to sustain that army for 4 years. And now to think that they would begin to recruit African American men into the Confederate Army. It's hard to imagine a bigger transformation. Waddell continued, if emancipation could not be effected safely in peaceful terms, how can it be accomplished in times like these? I shudder at the prospect. And that's one thing for us to think about. You know, historians know that every enslaved person in the South could have been purchased for what the Civil War cost. And Lincoln kept saying, really, let me buy the slaves and end it. And now it's all gone. And so after 250 years of enslavement, African Americans become free when the economy is devastated, when the framework is knocked out. And so white people like Waddell can say, emancipation would have been hard if we'd done it over time and when things were prosperous. The South had its largest cotton crop ever in 1860. Right? Slavery's getting stronger and stronger. The Southern economy's getting stronger and stronger. We've been able to sort of ride that prosperity. But now the South loses its global monopoly in cotton during the war itself to Egypt and India. And so, like, the bottom's been knocked out of the whole economy for everybody. So Waddell says, if emancipation couldn't be done when things were good, what's it going to be like now? When Lee surrendered, the Confederacy fell apart almost instantly in April. Quote, For several days past, the people in this town and county have been appropriating all the public property they could find, wagons, old iron picks, etc., distributing the assets of the Confederate States. What a termination. Same thing happened in Richmond. As soon as the Confederate Army's gone, people breaking in to all the warehouses and shops and taking. They figured the government doesn't exist anymore, it belongs to me. I've sacrificed enough over the last 4 years. Now, Waddell wrote, almost everybody looks forward to peace and reunion on any tolerable terms Lincoln may offer. To talk about reunion and contemplate it as an event about to occur after all we have suffered is almost intolerable. And indeed, the white South had proclaimed repeatedly that it would never submit, that it could not be defeated as long as there were any white men to fight, and yet, right here they were, in fact, defeated completely at the mercy of the Yankees that they claimed to be of a different race. Waddell said they would do whatever Lincoln demanded. Whatever Lincoln demanded. But then something also unimaginable happened. Waddell reported the latest rumors. Yesterday there were many afloat. One that Lincoln had been assassinated in Washington City. Another that a French fleet was on the coast of North Carolina. A third that a Yankee force was coming up the valley, paroling our soldiers as they were met on the road. Don't know how we are to subsist. I have not a cent of money and no prospect of getting any. Can't buy anything to eat or to wear. Now, it turned out, of course, that only one of those rumors was true. Though the details were mangled, and Waddell did not want to believe the truth. Quote, Lincoln was certainly killed in the theater, as reported. The assassin was an actor named Booth, an Englishman. Booth was not regarded as a Southern sympathizer, having left Richmond early in the war to go north. Rumor says that some persons at the North attribute the murder to the ultra-abolitionists who were disaffected on account of Lincoln's supposed leniency to the South. So who killed Lincoln? The abolitionist, right? Or at least an Englishman. Now, as shocking as all this was, it was really the aftermath of slavery that disturbed Waddell. Quote, it was provoking, ludicrous, and pitiful altogether to see the poor Negroes crowding the streets, some of them, especially the women, dressed in all their finery, rejoicing in their freedom. The poor creatures seemed to imagine that to be free carries all the ills of life, and many of them leave kind masters and good homes to suffer and die among people who have no sympathy for them and only wish to spite us. Freedom to them means respite from toil, care, and trouble. So white Southerners can only imagine that this is really just to get at them. That freedom for black people is not really about freedom for black people. It's just a way to get at white Southerners. And the Yankees cannot possibly mean anything good toward the African American population. The whole social fabric will be destroyed, Waddell said, and the Negroes to be the chief sufferers. This, however, is probably what the Yankee nation desires to accomplish. Destroy us and the Negroes together. This is philanthropy with a vengeance. Alas for the poor Negro. His truest, best friend has always been the intelligent Christian slaveholder of the South. Ruthlessly taken from such guardianship, tempted and deluded with the pretended boon of freedom, seduced from home and friends, the Negroes go out to suffer and die. It is preposterous to imagine that the master, in a majority of cases, can maintain the aged and young slaves when deserted by all the able-bodied. Now, back before the war, Waddell did something that you very seldom see. He admitted to himself in his diary that he didn't think slavery was right. And he said the best that we can do is be good Christian masters. But he says the only thing worse than slavery are the abolitionists. And so do you see what the story is? That if you deny that there could be any sincerity on the part of the white North, then it kind of undercuts his genuine sympathy. And I mean, he writes it with affection in other times of African American people that he knows. So it gives you some sense of the complexity of what's going on there. But he believes that the Yankees want to destroy African Americans. He tells other parts where sometimes the formerly enslaved people go to the Yankee troops and then they are pushed away. And he says this shows their real feelings. But then if the Yankee troops take them with them, that shows their real feelings, which is just to deprive the South. So there's nothing that's going to happen now. And people wonder about, have things ever been this in much turmoil in American history? If you want to see the biggest change that ever happened in American history. It was right here. The end of the largest and most powerful system of slavery in the modern world overnight. Okay? Nothing else in American history compares to the scale or consequence of that happening. So already, we've seen from a black soldier and from a white Southerner and from the white newspapers at the time, and you would not know they're living through the same history. They're just talking right past each other, which is the way history is, which is the job of people who want to understand the past. Are all these people telling the truth? Yes, of what they see. So our job is to figure out why could they see what they could see and why could they not see what they couldn't. And then how do the different pieces fit together? And that's fundamentally the job of the historian, is to see how things might align in a way that nobody at the time thought they did. If you're just repeating what people at the time said, you're missing something, because people weren't agreeing with each other basically about anything. The North was divided against itself. I could show you the Democratic newspaper of the same time, and you would not know it's from the same town in the same time, because basically they are as full of contempt. Well, matter of fact, let me just give you a quote about what they say about all of this. So here's how Waddell finishes, and then I will go into what the Democrats of the North said. The whole Negro population set free, brought into collision with free white labor. How can it bear up in this struggle? They go forth like Cain, with every man's hand against them. No friend, no protector, an inferior race, to be trampled upon and finally exterminated. The next 20 years will witness scenes at which humanity will shudder, and in 50 years the Negro will disappear from the continent, killed by the kindness of Northern philanthropy. Okay? Now, obviously, the analogy is the American Indians, right? Who were, at this time, and over the next few decades, nearly exterminated. And white Southerners, literally could not imagine that black people could get along by themselves. Now, to our eyes, look back, but they've been supporting you for 250 years. What do you think that they can't get along? Who's been raising the crops? Who's been taking care of the livestock? Who's often been raising children? Why would you think they couldn't do it themselves? But that is the white understanding, is that this is going to be the end of the black population of America, is that the end of slavery will be the end of them. Okay? And I believe Joseph Waddell, even though right at his next entry after this, he does not have enough money to buy another book, and so he stops his diary. I should be grateful that he kept it going through the whole 4 years and got to the end. But that also gives you some sense of, I think it's tempting today to kind of brush aside white suffering. But they were. The people gave everything they had to the Confederacy. And remained loyal until there was nothing really left to give. And so that's a fact too. And so sometimes those two things are put in opposition to each other. The white South couldn't really have believed in the Confederacy, and so they must have given up. I just don't see it. They were defeated. At the same time that African Americans never gave up and are trying to keep alive this hope throughout all these years. Now, so at the same time Waddell is writing this, the Freedmen's Bureau comes to Augusta County in March of 1865. So you notice, up to this point, we're still before Appomattox. Okay? And the Freedmen's Bureau established an office in Stanton and then operated for the next 3.5 years. And here's how the first agent wrote to the main office to describe the situation in Augusta County. I have the honor to report that the condition of the freedmen in this district is generally good, and that the operations of this bureau have positively and by its presidents negatively added greatly to the attainment of such condition. The freedmen, having learned that they will be protected in the exercise of unquestionable rights, and the former masters now knowing that they may not ill-treat or unjustly use them with impunity. The freedmen have, however, a vague dread of being soon deprived of the assistance now given by this bureau, and are thus repressed in their aspirations for manhood through fears of being left at the mercy of implacable neighbors who now secretly vaunt the terrible things they will do when the Yankees, and with indescribable sneers, the Freedmen's Bureau are gone. So here's a former Union officer saying, it's only the Freedmen's Bureau that's holding everything together. And what's wrong with these black men that they seem to think that we might leave someday, and that when we do, that things might be hard for them? Why can't they have manhood and stand up? Don't you hate that? I don't want to see an ad for Hitachi on there. I want to see Valley of Shadow. And vague dread that they may be left on their own. And of course, the vague dread happens pretty darn soon. So you got to think about, you're a formerly enslaved family. You're living on the land of the people who owned the land before, who still own it now. What's the right path of to whom should you be loyal? You know, to whom should you be deferential? You can go to the Freedmen's Bureau, and they'll be your ally right now. But 5 years from now, do you think that the federal government is still going to be adjudicating things between black people and white? Here's what else the Freedmen's Bureau writes. Among the old and infirm and women with 3 or more little children, there's now considerable suffering which will increase with the approach of winter. Partial issues of rations prevent starvation, but wood is also needed to defend them from the cold. The local authorities profess inability to, and until compelled by law, will not make any provision for the support of colored paupers, and the former masters are only prevented from setting many adrift by the knowledge that it is not permitted, although there are instances in which the old ones are cherished on account of family associations and for long and faithful service. So, in other words, white Southerners and white Northerners have exactly opposite interpretations of who's to fault. White Southerners say, we're taking care of people, and the Yankees are killing them. And the Yankees say, we're taking care of black people, and the white Southerners are killing them. But the fact is that black people were largely taking care of themselves. Here is, again, so the Valley of the Shadow is filled with just sometimes a Joseph Waddell diary is hundreds of pages long. Sometimes we have one document, one shred of paper from a person. It's very eloquent. Here is Isabella Burton talking to the Freedmen's Bureau. Horace Bucker sold my 2 sons, 7 and 5 years of age. Benjamin Horace sold to Lark and Wright in Madison County, Virginia. Johnny Gilgarnett and Jeremiah Gilgarnett were playmates. I am living in Stanton now, a widow and alone, and would very much like to see them. So she writes to the Freedmen's Bureau, maybe you can find my children. So they were 7 and 5 when they were sold away. And this was the main thing that African American people did after the war. Where's my mother? Where's my father? Where are my children? Where's my brother? Where's my sister? They turned to the Freedmen's Bureau. And one of the other documents that you can see in the Valley of the Shadow is the 1870 census, in which everybody's listed, and Ms. Burton's still on her own. She does not find her children. So here's a letter from a man, Nelson Irwin, a year after the head of the Freedmen's Bureau in Stanton said that everything was fine. Living within your military department, I am forced to appeal to you in my own behalf. My case and cause are those of thousands, and just as I am affected, they will be affected also. There's a deep-laid organization here that governs and controls everything by might in defiance of truth and justice. On any, even the last pretense, a black man is taken up and imprisoned. His color is his condemnation. In every lawless act committed, he is accused of. At present, my brethren are living in a reign of terror, and many of them are locked up in Stanton jail. An act of theft has been committed here by 1 or 2 black men, and lo, 4 are taken up, and all of us are accused. Some of us had to fly who were as innocent of the crime as you are. The Freedmen's Bureau is ineffective, laughed at, and despised. On the first Monday of November, these men are to be tried, and in view of their case, we cannot expect justice unless the strong arm of military protection has reached out to us. We gave to the rich white man our best years, our strength, our youth, our sweat, and now that we are free, we get in return meanness, tyranny, and injustice. First of all, the fact that there's a former enslaved person 2 years after slavery able to write that is amazing. It tells you something about the complexity of slavery itself, but it also shows you that people knew exactly what was going on. A deep-laid organization. White Southerners are already mobilizing to make sure that the gains of African Americans are as limited as possible. So, despite this, and here's the other amazing thing that happens. The United States is unique in slavery coming to as immediate as end as it did. It's also unique in it being uncompensated to the former slaveholders, and it's also unique that the formerly enslaved men are enfranchised as voting citizens only 2 years later. Okay? So again, think about this, and think about if you're Joseph Waddell watching this, and he writes in his diary earlier, he says, in my youth we read of wars as something that happened in some other place in time. We never dreamed that America would see armies coming across our farm. Nobody, black or white, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, imagined in 1861 that by 1867 you'd have black men voting. Okay? And so that's something else. You got to forget what happened if you're going to understand what happened. Here's what the freedmen of Augusta County say too. This is 1867. They meet in a constitution. We, the freedmen of Augusta County, in mass meeting assembled, do recognize in the events of the late war the judgment and mercies of divine providence, as in sweeping as with the broom of destruction the foul wrong of human bondage from the face of our country. And trusting to Him for guidance, we will strive to use our personal and political freedom for the glory of His name and the advancement of the moral and material of all. Therefore, be it resolved that our grateful thanks are due to the gallant armies of the United States, who under providence followed the flag of liberty and union until victory crowned their efforts. Resolve that we hold in reverent remembrance the memories of those who fell in the cause of freedom, and especially of Abraham Lincoln, the signer of our deed of emancipation and the last martyr. Resolve that we demand that all elections, national, state, and local, shall be by secret ballot. Why is that a big deal? Because otherwise everybody's just standing there watching you vote, and it makes it really hard to vote in any way against your boss. That no man shall be ineligible to office by reason of sect or color. That trial by jury of peers is a right not to be withheld from any man, and we demand admission to the jury list as well as to the poll list. That we demand that the prohibition of whipping or maiming as a punishment of any crime be made a part of the law of the state. And that believing ignorance to be the fruitful parent of crime, wrong, and discord, we demand extraordinary state provision for the re-education of the young of all classes. Virginia doesn't have public education at this time, okay? And they're calling for, that is what we demand. Juries, voting, education. And of course, those things don't come to pass. Yeah? For a moment, it seems like those things might happen, the things that people are still talking about today. So here's what the Democratic newspaper in Franklin County had to say about all this. If any election of any kind were to be held in the South within the next month, there is no reasonable doubt that 3/4 of the Negro vote would be cast with the Southern white vote. There is perfect accord between the larger portion of freedmen and the white population. This is but natural. The Negroes were as ardent enemies of the North as their masters during the war. They had no theories to sustain and no special care as to what questions were involved in the context. The Southern Negro is very much like a hothouse plant. He needs constant care and advice. The future, therefore, looks doubtful to the Southern people. There is reason to fear that the Negro race will disappear. So the Democrats, even though they were brushed with the tar of treason throughout the war, and they voted against Abraham Lincoln in the same proportions in 1864 as they had in 1860, are now in sympathy with the Southern whites and say that the Republicans are the ones to blame for all this, right? So talking about the North and the South doesn't do justice to all of this, right? And that the North is as divided more divided than the white South at this time. So you put all these things in together, and you could become discouraged. But I want to end with this. I talked about all the ways that the United States is unique. The United States is unique, too, in that the African-American population of the South is the most successful post-emancipation population in world history. Okay? We all know the injustice and this poverty and the suffering, but we need to remember, too, that somehow African-Americans coming out of that system of slavery made lives for themselves remarkably quickly. Here's one reason why. People hear about these school marms. Let's imagine, some of you people have sons and daughters in college now. You know, like the hottest thing you can do when you finish college is do Teach for America, right? Well, they basically had Teach for America in 1866 and 1867. Young white women come to a place like Augusta County to teach the schools for the young black children. And here's one who came down and wrote her letter that's in the Valley of the Shadow. It seems to me that it is very pleasant work to try and help those who are so willing to learn. I do not regret coming here, and I like the work I'm engaged in very much. I did not expect to find so many pretty and interesting children among colored people. Some of them are quite small, and yet are almost the best and farthest advanced scholars we have, and look as bright as they are in reality. It is indeed a pleasure to see their pleasant and happy faces. This is Sarah Davis, and she described a scene that tells us a lot about the aspirations and accomplishments of the free people. The people were much pleased to see us. One of my scholars, a little girl, was standing upon a hill near her house. We saw her before she saw us, but as we drew near, she recognized us, and we soon knew she did. She stood a minute looking at us, then she threw up her hands and shouted a welcome, turned, and ran off as fast as she could to tell her mother who were coming. Arriving at the house, we found to be one of the neatest we had seen among the colored people. The mother, a most interesting colored person, both in manner and in appearance, as much like that of white. If she were seen north, her color and skin would never be suspected. We made a visit to the home of a girl we had known from school. Asking her why she had not been there, she explained she had to keep her house for her father, while her mother, who was hired out, was from home. She told us almost in tears that she could not come to day school, and her father would not allow her to attend night school. I have 5 adult scholars which meet every afternoon at a neighbor's house. Ask her if she would like to meet with these and recite her lessons. She was much pleased with the plan and has not missed one day yet. So think about what it means to long for education so much. And here's a fact. By 1890, almost half the African American population of the South was literate, going from a time where it had been illegal to be at a time when one of the higher rates of literacy of most places in the world. And here's another remarkable fact. In places like Appomattox County and Virginia as a whole, by 1900, 80% of black people who lived on a farm owned land. Now, the phrase was they owned the back ribs and the spare ribs and backbone, right? They didn't, and they often had to work on white people's farms. But by pooling all their work, all the resources, they could have some place where they could be safe. Some places that were theirs. And you can drive across Virginia today and see people who still live on farms that they were able to buy when everything was stacked against them in the 1880s, 1890s. That's a remarkable story, too. So, what's the moral of these stories, of this braid? These are all just from a couple of years that I'm telling you. Imagine this stretched across decades. We have to realize what poor predictors of the future we all are. Now, you could take from that and be scared. Or you could take from that and say, you know, better things can happen than we can imagine. Bigger changes can happen than we could possibly wrap our minds around. I grew up in the segregated South and watched it fall. I know that can happen. And I worry a little bit about young people today, discouraged. It feels like the big fights have been fought, and now it's just going to be kind of struggling along. But people in 1860 had no idea that the system of slavery was ready to fall either. Big things can happen. So the idea of tools like the Valley of the Shadow is to let people see the complexity of history, to see that it has all kinds of aspects that aren't the things that fit onto bumper stickers and that are just things that we would argue about. At Richmond today, at the university, we're making new projects. This is the one that we have a brand new one coming out in a couple of weeks, but this is the one I have to show you today, and I'll end with this. I want you all to go home and play with all these things. We had the entire Secession Debates. What did people actually say when they were seceding in Richmond? You can analyze all that and see what they're saying. This is, those of you who are Civil War buffs, and I assume if you're here on a Sunday morning, you are. This is the OR translated into geographic form. This is the 128 volumes of the official records of the War of the Rebellion. All the blue dots are where United States Army units were every 2 weeks in the war. And you can, and those of you know your history of the Civil War, you can see the various things happening that you know about. And one of the things that I love about this is that it shows the things that we have a hard time wrapping our minds around. We don't really have the bandwidth to tell ourselves 2 stories at one time. We can't really do the Eastern Western theater at the same time. This is showing this. But what are the red dots? That's everywhere the OR records African American people coming in contact with the United States Army. What this shows you, emancipation is not something that Abraham Lincoln is handing out on January 1st, 1863, and it's not something that automatically comes with the Union Army arriving, and it's not something that comes to a place once and then passes. Every one of these things is a black person risking a lot, maybe their lives, to see if they might have allies that they did not know that they had before. So this is a bazillion pieces of information. You can click on each one of those red dots and it will tell you that story. And you can filter it and you can say, I'm only interested in seeing the story of women. What did it mean to be a woman and try to make yourself free? Or young people? Or I also want to see the stories in the newspapers and all that. So we're making now a digital atlas of American history. And in a couple of weeks, you'll be able to see our first instance of that, which is what the slave trade looked like. And you'll see it's not big red arrows. It's like different counties are, even in Virginia, some are net gaining and some are losing all at the same time. And my belief is that we're at the beginning of a new golden age of history, in which history is not just things that some people make and give to other people and you believe it or not, but rather that will allow everybody to write their own history as well as make their own history of their lives. So that's what I would say to you here on this Sunday morning. We can talk about any of that you want to, and we still have time. So who would like to go first? Okay. Makes me nervous when two people want to ask. I'll get you, and then you. Yes, sir.
Dr. Ayers, you mentioned the term historiography.
Right. I tried not to. I'm sorry I messed up on that.
Well, and allow me to add two words, intellectual honesty.
Right.
And it seems to me, in my limited studies of history, that the historiography of this era has certainly undergone transformation. How can we remain intellectually honest in that advance of history?
Yeah, that's great. So historiography is the study of the writing of history. And basically it's what we teach in graduate school. Because if you don't have some idea of what everybody said before you get to you're not really going to be able to add to the conversation, right? So we have this radio show, weekly radio show, and I will say this is shameless, but I'm going to do it anyway. Backstoryradio.org. We were the number, all right, applause. We were the number 23 podcast in all of the United States a couple weeks ago. And I listened to our new show that came out yesterday about Lincoln's assassination. It's freaking awesome. I didn't actually make it. I do a part of all of this. And next week we'll have an episode based on what was happening in 1865. And they were at the park on Thursday when I was here speaking, interviewing people, but they also interviewed people in Richmond for that. And we did a live show. So intellectual honesty, we don't allow ourselves to say historiography because we don't want to alienate anybody who thinks history is dull anyway, but we're fooling them into, they're listening to history without actually knowing that's what they're doing. So, but frankly, I do believe that sharing the entire evidentiary base that we're using is the best way to have intellectual honesty. You could look at this and say, well, Ayers makes this argument, but I'm going back and look at all the newspapers there and see, did he just choose the quotes that supported his position? Is there countervailing evidence on that? I think, we have billions of words now we didn't have just 10 years ago of all the words of newspapers. We have a project here that reads the New York Times and the Richmond Dispatch and maps all the words in them. We couldn't have done that before. So I think that before, the people who got to write the books also got to keep the note cards, right? And that the process of historiography was then somebody else going back and looking at all the note cards and seeing if it had a different argument. But what it would be if everybody who read the book could see every piece of evidence on which it was based. So I think the people who are going to keep us intellectually honest are the people who read the books or who go to the websites. So that's my feeling. I would say that historiography by itself has a strong tendency to correct itself. So you'll see, for a long time, people were arguing that Reconstruction was a terrible travesty against white Southerners, right? Then we switch over the other way. It didn't go nearly far enough. They should have taken everybody out and shot them who'd been a Confederate, right? And now we come back to the point, and we get more honest in the sense that we get more accurate. We get a fuller accounting of it as time goes by. I think that process can be accelerated if we let everybody in on what we're making it from. Okay? Yes, sir.
I'm not a big fan of alternative history, but I think...
But it's fun, though, isn't it?
I think it makes us think a little more precise about what went on.
I have no objection to it.
I have this question. Let's say the gentleman on my left had not gone before the
Right.
And let's say also that he turned out to be the Roosevelt of the 19th century. Served 3-4 more terms, extremely popular as he was, particularly the war over.
Yeah.
What would have been the effect on what you're doing now as far as the Reconstruction?
I think maybe that's the big question in American history. And I heard a prominent professor from the UK ask that one time at the University of Richmond, and he said something that shocked me, which is that it probably would have delayed the civil rights movement. He said because if you'd not had the white South fight back so intransigently in 1866 with the Memphis and New Orleans race riots and the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Codes, you wouldn't have had the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. And if you don't have those, you don't have the foundation for the civil rights movement later on. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? You know, is that Reconstruction is basically caused by the white South in the form that it happened. You heard Joseph Waddell say, we're ready to do whatever Lincoln says. Well, Lincoln never gets to say what he would do, and we have no idea what he would have done. You know, in Louisiana, he said you give the vote to intelligent black men who had fought for the Union, right? It's probably what he would have done. But can we really think that the white South is going to give up anything it doesn't absolutely have to give up? People throughout world history have not, right? So would we have been better off if Lincoln had lived? It seems undeniable. But ironically, did things have to get worse before they could get better? I don't know. I think that if you look at the global picture and you look at other places where slavery has been ended, it's not been easy anywhere, right? People who have claimed to own other people, to have run everything, tend not to give that up just because they lose a war, right? So you could argue that if Lincoln had lived and had been able to do what he did during the war, which is keep the different wings of the Republican Party in balance, you wouldn't have had radical Reconstruction. You would have had a moderate Reconstruction. And it's hard to see how that's actually going to bring greater justice. So that's my own feeling about it, is that I'm not sure there was a shortcut through history. I just made that line up. I'll use that again. So, well, that's good. Yes, John?
And when did African Americans in Augusta County celebrate emancipation, given that it occurred before Appomattox, but then it occurred against the Sheridan's Army in Ottawa? Did they have a set emancipation day in future decades?
You know, I resent you asking me that, John, because I don't know yet, because the irony is that the great, so I published that book in 2003, and then I was supposed to be on leave in 2006 and 2007, and then I became president of the University of Richmond instead, and that's a pretty hard job, and I've been doing it for 8 years, and so I've not really allowed myself to look ahead very much, because what I like every day is waking up and discovering this stuff and sort of being in the moment. Here's what I do know, is that the City Council of Stanton recently voted to take the statue that was going to have been in the Museum to Slavery that Doug Wilder was going to create. And so Augusta County, the Shenandoah Valley generally now is much less, has many fewer African Americans than it did at the time. Augusta County would have been over 20% enslaved, which is about the average for the South as a whole, right? But then today I think it's probably single digits, because you're close enough to the train to get the heck out of Dodge and go north sooner than the Great Migration, right? And so it's my experience is that people in the Shenandoah Valley somehow believe that the movie Shenandoah, rather than they believe the history, right, is that we weren't really into slavery, and we weren't really, at the same time, they're very proud of supporting Stonewall Jackson. Anyway, so I think that the African-American history and African-American community there is kind of, I think now, it went into a long decline and is the 20th century gone. So all that's saying, there's a section on the Valley Project about the memory of the war. I could probably have answered that in the amount of time that I took to not answer it now, but I didn't want to turn my back on people. And you need to remember, I'm also your boss, John, so we'll have fun. Yes, Mr. Lincoln. Hi.
Now, if we wanted to listen to the podcast of Backstory, now, how would we do that?
Well, it's easy. There's two different ways, and there's a little extra something in your envelope at payday now too. But you can either go to iTunes and download them all, and they're all free, of course. And you can look. I'm sorry. You can see I really can't type at the same time. But this is the website for the show, and there's the latest show. Now He Belongs to the Ages. The three of us talk about. They also said Now He Belongs to the Angels, and we discuss not so much who's right, but why. What would each of those have meant? It's interesting. So you can download every show that we have here, and it takes no time. They're an hour long. It's a weekly show. We are in 157 communities every week across the country. So if you download it right there, just put it on your iPhone or your computer, you can listen to it anytime.
And it is very, very informative and humorous. I would also add on to that.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. You're a poor judge of character, but I appreciate that. What else we got? Yes?
What was the opinion of Andrew Johnson on Main Street?
Yeah.
Two places.
He really pulled Americans together by everybody despising him. Yeah, you know. Now, I should say I went to Andrew Johnson Elementary School in Upper East Tennessee, and we didn't know much about him, but we knew he'd been president. It was good enough for us, and about 30 miles where he's from. And, I think that he gets a short shrift for the earlier person that he was. Why was he the vice president in the first place? Because he was the only senator from the South who had the courage to stay with the United States when the Confederacy left. Okay? And then he was governor of Tennessee when it was, after it had been reoccupied by the United States. And he was much admired by the Republicans, who thought that here's what we're dreaming of, a white Southern man who has the guts to stand up for what's right. And so in 1864, the Republicans don't think they're even going to win. Johnson does not think Lincoln does not think he's going to be renominated in 1864, in August of 1864. And had it not been for other things that happened in the Valley, Sheridan, as well as Sherman in Atlanta, he wouldn't have been reelected. They changed the name of the party for that election to the Union Party, and they put Johnson in there to suggest it's going to be about reunification of the country. So that's why Johnson is vice president, because it's part of a vision that he and Lincoln share, which is that the point is to put the country back together again. The difference is that Johnson thinks you put the country back together again by sacrificing the rights of African Americans. Lincoln had pushed at every step to expand that possibility. So what this means is that Johnson makes this long tour and alienates many Democrats as well as many Republicans. And then the white South, after they get their pardons from him, see him as kind of also a white Northerner who's not really being helpful to them. So everybody despises Andrew Johnson. And, I resent the fact that he's seen as incompetent because he's a hillbilly, because I am too, and that he was a self-taught, intelligent man, but he just got on the wrong side of history. If he had actually said, let's complete what we've started rather than starting to pull back, I think we would have a different opinion of him today. I think he had the capacity, but he just had a blind spot when it came to the dignity and rights of African Americans, and that's hurt him on every front. I see Josie out of my peripheral vision moving to suggest that we are that.
Anyone has one last question? We have time for that.
Will this video be available to us?
It's my understanding that it will be on YouTube from the Museum of the Confederacy, American Civil War Museum site. Is that right? And with that, and if you're watching it, thank you very much for joining us. Thank all of you. Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you.